Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sally Penni. I'm the founder of Women in the Law UK, and I chair, as much as I can, these lunch and learns. If you've not joined us before, you're very welcome. I can see there are some new people there. Stuart, I'm going to hand over to you. Super, Stuart, this should work. Wonderful. Let's get going.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And I'm Stuart Anderson, as you said, founder of Alpha Public Relations. And today, I'm going to talk to you about working with the traditional, or what some people might call antisocial media, in order to build your professional profile and so benefit your career and your firm, and in the long run, hopefully attract more of the kind of business that you want to be doing. And now, no, it does work. Excellent. Last time I did this, I had all kinds of trouble with it, but no, it's working. Brilliant. So first, a bit about me. I set up Alpha Public Relations in 2017 after spending about 20 years working in media and marketing. Spent most of that time as a journalist working for business and financial trade publications, in many cases the editor. Now, at the very beginning of my career, though, I spent a couple of years working in a specialist business-to-business PR agency. And latterly, before setting up Alpha Public Relations, I spent 5 years as the in-house head of marketing and communications at a financial services firm in Cheshire. So I've got a pretty good perspective on what everyone's looking for when it comes to getting professionals featured in the media and how to balance everyone's competing needs and objectives. So today, I'm going to give you an overview of the reasons for engaging in PR and give you some pointers as to how you can get started in the most effective way. I'm conscious that some of you will work for firms that have in-house PR people or an external agency, while others of you might just have a marketing executive, and still others are working for yourselves and doing all of it by yourselves. So with this in mind, I've included some sections on working with PR departments and PR agencies for those of you, but also for those of you who are acting as your own PR people. This should give you some pointers as to how you need to think about yourself and your business when you have that hat on as being, if you like, your own PR agent. And on the agenda today, then, we have what is PR and why bother with it, types of coverage and how journalism works, getting your news featured, featuring in features, working with your PR department or agency, understanding and building relationships with journalists, avoiding the wrong kind of publicity, which is quite important, and also what's changed in the last 10, 12 weeks, and finally where it all fits in with social media. Okay, so what is PR and why engage in it? Over the years, there have been many definitions of public relations, but the way I like to describe it is the process of building and maintaining the reputation that you want based on coverage in what we in the trade call earned media. Now, by earned media, we mean coverage in the press or perhaps other companies' blogs that is at the discretion of a journalist or editor and that you haven't paid for. This is a highly effective way of amplifying your owned, in inverted commas, media. And that's things like your website, your social media accounts, and any paid for advertising. Because people may be skeptical and mistrustful of journalists, but getting covered in the traditional media, in which I would include websites staffed by actual journalists, as well as things like newspapers and radio and that sort of thing, remains really the only way of getting really properly famous. Now, the cachet that comes from regular positive mentions in the press should supercharge all your other communication and marketing channels. So it's not just about new clients. It's also a best way of getting your message across. Although it is the best way of getting your message across to new relevant audiences that haven't heard of you yet. But it also helps cement existing relationships and can improve staff morale and aid in recruitment. Having a good reputation in your trade media could mean the best candidates coming to you, so saving on recruitment costs into the bargain. And finally, for those of you who are climbing the career ladder, it builds a personal brand that can be leveraged in negotiations with existing or prospective employers. If you're a private client lawyer, say, who can get a senior personal finance correspondent from a national paper on the phone anytime you've got something worth saying to them, then that's something I believe should be priced into your remuneration, because it's a value. So, which media are we talking about? So to reach the various audiences you might want to communicate with, there are a range of media you may need to deal with. These include newspapers, both national and local, and I would say never discount your local paper. People keep writing them off, but they're often still a great way of maintaining what we in marketing speak call salience, which in other words means being top of mind in people that you want to be. And that's, you know, top of mind with people in what should in many cases be your heartland. Local papers are also the most likely media to feature your stories about having taken on new apprentices or making modest donations to local charities, sort of, you know, the nice stories, if you like, but that aren't of national interest. People talk a lot about corporate citizenship these days, and engaging with your local paper is a way both to demonstrate this and indeed to further it by communicating with your local community. Also, the general business press, both regional and nationally, but realistically, in a lot of cases, it's going to be regional, can also be good places to feature news about your firm. And if you're involved in areas like, say, corporate, commercial, or property, they were also, those sort of titles are also often keen to feature the work you've completed for clients. It's great for your reputation with clients and also with other professionals like accountants or bankers who might be in a position to recommend you. Now, to get your message across to potential clients, you can, if you're, say, business to business, engage with their trade media, maybe in the form of contributing articles on relevant subjects in which you have expertise. If you deal direct with the public and consumers, there will also be opportunities in the specialist media they might read. So the personal finance press, if you work in private client, for example. Other areas such as family law, employment law, and many areas of criminal law will be of interest to the mainstream news media. That's both print and broadcast. That said, I'm not an expert in broadcast, so what I'm talking about today is mainly with reference to print and online media. A lot of what I'm going to say also holds true for broadcast media, of course, but the timescales that they're dealing in tend to be even shorter. And if it's an area in which you'd like to get involved in a big way, then I'd recommend speaking to a specialist and getting some media training so that you come across in a way that does credit to you and your firm when you are actually, you know, in front of the camera. My final point on this is that you need to be realistic. To feature regularly in the media, you need to make it into their consideration set, so to become someone that they write about. And that takes time and maybe quite a few appearances in their inboxes to establish familiarity with you and your news. This can be helped by having a PR agent or manager who's already known to the journalists in question, but even then, shouldn't expect miracles overnight. I don't like to talk about it being a marathon, not a sprint, but in most cases, it is at least 1,500 meters. Now, the different types of coverage that you might expect to receive that will be useful for you too. I think they're fairly self-explanatory, and I'll be going into more detail on each of these later, but I'll just read them off the slide for now. So you've got your firm's news in which you're involved or on which you have an opinion or an insight, comments in features written by journalists about your field of experience or expertise, personal profile interviews and Q&A features, articles written by you about your field of expertise or on behalf of you in some cases about your field of expertise, and opinion articles written by you. Right, now, how journalism works. Well, it's not nearly as much fun as it used to be when I started out, and then it wasn't as much fun apparently as it was a decade earlier. However, although the shabby lunches have gone out the window, in many ways journalism's loss is your gain. The proliferation of email newsletters and that sort of thing, combined with cost cutting in newsrooms, means many publications are really hungry for material. They've got fewer resources to process it. That means that a decent press release, in many cases, is likely to be published verbatim. Obviously, your news is going to be featured alongside an awful lot of other stories, but in the online world, nothing's wasted, nothing's lost. If you get a good online snippet, then it's not just a question of who reads it on the day it's published. You can also send the link on to your clients and contacts, post it on your website, and use it on social media. It's a gift that keeps on giving. As we mentioned before, though, the media do tend to focus on people they've already heard of, so you need to be prepared to put in the groundwork. If you keep at it, though, then eventually you should benefit from a snowball effect. One other point, media are always on the lookout for novelty, but they also tend to fixate on certain subjects and angles, as you'll know as consumers of the news yourselves. They want to inform their readers, but they don't want to have to explain a new concept from first principles. So you need to frame your ideas in a way that coincides with their existing agenda. Best way to do this is to think about the practical applications of what you want to say. Ask yourself what it means from the perspective of their readers, not what it means to you. This slide illustrates what I mean. You have things that are important to you, and readers have things that are important to them. News happens where the two circles intersect. All right, how will editors assess your news? The publications with which you deal will have editorial guidelines. There are things they write about and things that they don't. So think about The Lawyer, for instance, which a lot of you will have read, obviously. And when did you last read an article in there about a high street firm raising money for their local hospice? Or for that matter, about a new partner at a regional firm? They're only usually interested in their top 200 firms, and of them, really, probably just the top 100. So you could waste an awful lot of time and effort trying to get featured in there, when a simple question of scale means it just won't happen, unless you happen, of course, to work for one of the top 200 or 100 firms, in which case, happy days. There are many other examples of this sort of thing. So before pitching to the editor of a title, take some time to read it and see if they have ever written about anything remotely similar. And geography is also a consideration for that regional and local publications. If you're based in Bristol, say, then you might think your new office move, back in the days when people had office moves, it should be of interest to people in Cardiff, which is less than an hour's drive away. In truth, though, you're very unlikely to make it into a Welsh publication, though you probably will feature, weirdly enough, in regional publications read 170 miles away in Truro, because it would still be the southwest. And the same would be true of a firm in North Manchester, where I'm sat. You know, your news won't get published by Yorkshire magazines read a few miles away in Huddersfield, but they'll all be reading about you up in Penrith, 150 odd miles away, even though they're more likely to go to Newcastle than Manchester for legal advice. Also, bear in mind that journalists are people and busy people, and sometimes they just won't get it, even when they should. Then you just can't win them all sometimes. The biggest tip I'd give you, though, is to pretend that your story is about one of your competitors. If you were to read it with their name in there in place of yours, what would you think? Would you be interested, or would you be just wondering what the editor was thinking who published this crap? So actually, we need to add a third circle to our Venn diagram of news, which is editorial policy. As you can see, the bullseye not only reflects your interests and those of readers, but also the outlet's editorial policies. Now, women in the law are going to send these slides on to you afterwards when I get around sending it on to them. So I'm not going to get into too much detail here about these, but what I will say is that when it comes to news and press releases, keep it simple. Lawyers often like caveating things and presenting a number of interpretations. Journalists really don't. And when your email arrives, you've got a second or two in terms of the title of it to make an editor want to read your story at all. And if you make it past that hurdle, then maybe 30 seconds for them to skim it and decide whether it merits proper consideration. You don't have to like it, but sadly that's the way it is. So clarity is vital. And there's one other thing. It's relatively uncommon for this to happen in trade and professional media now. But sometimes journalists do like to trip you up. So be careful not to include facts in a press release that could have another opposite interpretation to the one that you're giving them, and that interpretation being detrimental to you. Right. Now, although news is the primary medium for coverage for your firm or your brand, for individual lawyers and other professionals, the best chance of regular coverage is actually to feature in features. To do which, obviously, I'm sure you all know what I mean. But you know, generally, the more in-depth articles in the usually in the second half of a magazine, or that are in that you scroll down to find on a website. To do this, you need to work out what differentiates you, what you can help with, not necessarily better than anyone else, but at least differently. You don't have to be the best, but you do have to be good, and you do have to be interesting. Now, fortunately, I don't believe that any areas of professional practice are intrinsically boring or intrinsically interesting. It's up to you to make it interesting, and that's mostly by a combination of thinking about what any given subject really means to readers, and also by expressing an opinion. Facts alone are valuable, but there's no reason for a journalist to quote you regurgitating them. There are three main ways you can position yourself as an expert in the media. One is by writing entire articles about your field of expertise, or getting somebody like me to ghostwrite them for you. The other two are to provide comments or interviews to journalists who are writing long-form features about subjects, and by providing comments or interviews that give journalists extra context around breaking news. Finally, as well as sharing your expertise, you can also share your story. There are various opportunities for people to feature in profile interviews, articles which range from cover story interviews for big names to quick Q&A questionnaires that tend to go on to form the sort of 5 minutes with type articles that you sometimes see down the sidebar of a magazine. I'm going to talk more lately about building relationships with journalists so you can get featured in these ways. But if you have a PR department or agency, then the first thing that you need to do is to speak to them. Sadly, being the in-house communications or marketing person in some professional services firms can be a bit of a thankless task. It's a habit among some fee earners to treat them as an extension of the admin department and as implementers rather than strategic thinkers. Now, of course, sometimes this is true, and we've all met some of those people, but I'd like you to ask you to start by giving them the benefit of the doubt and assuming they know what they're doing and why they're doing it. You'll probably find that as long as you have an appropriate level of seniority or expertise, they'll be only too happy to seek out opportunities for you to get featured in the press. They'll be aided in this greatly if you keep them up to date with what is going on in your department and in your field of practice more widely. Most of all, though, be reliable. If you say you're going to call a journalist, then call them. If you say you'll write an article, then write it. Media deadlines aren't flexible, so don't commit to anything you might not be able to deliver. And speaking as a PR agent, my only asset is my reputation with journalists for delivering a level of quality and for doing so consistently and reliably. If I had a client who jeopardized that by being flaky or by being rude to journalists, then I'd need to think hard about the appropriateness of representing that client for the sake of all my others. Now, let's just take a moment to look at this slide. It shows what journalists want from you and also what your PR people want from you, which are in some ways the same, but in other ways they're very different. Journalists basically want you to be indiscreet and scurrilous. PR people want you to be cautious and toe the party line. But to become a successful regular media personality, you're going to need to find a balance between the two that keeps journalists interested, but also keeps you employed. Now, a word on avoiding bad publicity. First thing I'd say is that if your firm isn't currently engaged in PR, then make sure all the skeletons have been cleared out of your cupboard before you start. If you have unresolved disputes in which you could be construed as being in the wrong, then maybe don't start a conversation with the media until they've been resolved. Look at the comments section on the website of any newspaper or indeed of any professional trade magazine to see why I'm saying this. And something else that I can't emphasize enough is the need to treat journalists with courtesy. Sometimes they might be brusque, but it's generally because they're incredibly busy or just because that's how they've been trained to talk to get rid of PR people with names like Rupert and Tabitha. But whatever you do, never treat their questions as stupid because they might be learning about the subject you're discussing for the first time. Or they could be asking a question to which they already know the answer full well, just to give you the chance to be the one who explains that subject to their readers from first principles and gets quoted doing so. Now, remember, if a journalist thinks you're a decent human being, then they're more likely to give you a fair hearing if and when things go wrong and hit the fan. Here are a few more tips. I'll leave you to read over them properly when you get your copy of the slides, but I think the two most important lessons here are to be prepared, particularly if you're talking to a journalist in a crisis situation. And above all, don't lie. If it's a real crisis, then seek advice from an expert before talking to the media. And don't precipitate a crisis yourself either. So don't volunteer your expertise in unfair dismissal claims to a journalist if your firm's currently involved in an acrimonious dispute with a former employee that's heading for a tribunal. It's just asking for trouble, really. Now, a few tips on building and maintaining relationships with journalists. These are mostly relevant to those of you who don't have PR representatives, though far from exclusively so. The big things are, as we have said before, to communicate with maximum clarity and also to maintain consistent communication. Also, and it pains me to say this as a PR agent, but journalists are much keener to have a relationship with you than they are with me or with your in-house PR manager. Keep your PRs informed of what you're doing, but if a journalist wants to speak to you, then in the first instance, speak to them. Of course, you may want over time to train your contacts in the press to go to your PRs first for basic inquiries that they can handle just as well as you can, but don't do anything that will dilute your relationship too much. Right, dealing with journalists. Now, copy approval by interviewees is a big bugbear for most journalists, and even if they grudgingly give in to someone who demands it, they'll probably never go back to them again in future. It's a matter of principle. You wouldn't expect the media to give a politician the right to approve what's reported about them before going to print, so you can't expect them to let you do it either. We could say that there's a fine line where you could be on one side of that argument or the other, but where you draw that line, it's impossible. So that's why in many cases they just have to say it's a blanket no. Of course, so you do want to make sure you're quoted accurately. So by all means, volunteer to check factual details. And if you're really not confident either in them or in what you might have said or might say, then what you can do is offer an off-the-record conversation followed by some written on-the-record comments. If you do want to do this, though, then make sure you do it before, not after the conversation starts, because there's nothing worse than having it, as a journalist, than having what you think is a brilliant interview with somebody, and then them saying, "Oh, but you will send me the quotes, won't you? I just need to run them past compliance." But yeah, so also if you do provide written comments, then make them genuinely interesting and send them over quickly too. Right, only a couple more slides now. So the question everybody's been asking themselves, how has coronavirus changed this? Well, firstly, because journalists are working from home and not able to meet each other in person, news meetings aren't occurring in the usual way they would. This means your press releases, etc., need to be clearer than ever, because journalists who receive them will be selling stories to their editors via Zoom rather than passing bits of paper around and chewing the fat. So you need to make it easy for them by keeping things as simple as you can, including proper facts and figures wherever you can. You should have been doing this anyway, of course, but you know. Also, because they're working from home, journalists have even less time than usual for lengthy chats on the phone with people they've never spoken to before. So if you're pitching to a journalist, then do it with a pithy email. Coronavirus itself is obviously still the biggest business story in town. So wherever you have a COVID-19 related angle, do use it. Not gratuitously, but if, for example, you've inducted new team members via Microsoft Teams, then talk about it. This goes a bit wider than that as well, really. It's something that I haven't mentioned before, but you know, you might think, oh, it's jumping on a bandwagon, it's tacky or whatever, but that's PR. If there is a bandwagon, then don't just jump on it, you know, kind of completely drag your entire family onto it as well. That's how it works, unfortunately. Anyway, the other good news at the moment is that if you have any modestly positive news that would usually be a bit meh, it's got more of a chance now because all the other news out there is so unremittingly awful. The other obvious thing is that in-person schmoozing is off the agenda for the foreseeable future. If you're not based in London, in particular, or in other city centres, then this potentially actually helps you level the playing field. Of course, if you are, as some of you are, then the playing field that you that was stacked in your favour is slightly less so now. But there is also a huge irony in that many firms are slashing their marketing budgets at the moment, but there's actually a huge appetite from the media for legal insights at the moment on everything ranging from employment law to probate. And this is only going to increase as the economic crisis unfolds. Because people are still largely stuck working from home, there's actually a captive audience for all this stuff when it's published too. So if you're going to invest in anything now, invest in PR. Okay, last one. How does all this fit with social media? First of all, for those of you who are DIYing PR rather than have an agency or a PR department, you can find opportunities for comment by searching Twitter, which is the platform of choice of most journalists. So search on there for the hashtag #JournoRequest. Something all of you should also do is to follow relevant journalists on Twitter and connect with them on LinkedIn. They'll mostly be glad to accept your LinkedIn connections, and as long as you have a comprehensive profile, it's a good way of showcasing your credentials to them so that then they may well come to you for comment. Also, obviously, engage with them as you would with any other key contact. Now, as I said at the beginning of this session, one of the great things about online media coverage is that you can link to it in your social media posts. When you do this, I'd recommend tagging in the publication and journalist, both as a courtesy to them and because you might get a retweet or like, and they probably have a lot more followers than you do. I'll leave you, though, with one potentially costly word of warning. Well, not if you heed it. And, clearly this is the voice of bitter experience. Don't take a photo of some print coverage that you've achieved and post it on social media or anywhere else online, as there are copyright licensing agencies out there that are actively looking for this kind of thing and imposing significant backdated charges for infringements. I might think they're sharks. Everybody who's come across them might think they're sharks, but that doesn't make them any less real, unfortunately. So don't go swimming with them. Anyway, on that cheerful note, many thanks for listening to me, and I will leave Sally to marshal any questions that you have.
Brilliant. Can we all do a clap for Stuart, please?
Thank you very much.
Excellent. Stuart, that was really good.